Tonight we're in lesson number 6 in our study of the book of James. This is going to be James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. And James is going to draw a contrast between the wisdom of the world and heavenly wisdom. So let's begin tonight by just reading these 5 verses. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exists, confusion and everything will be there. Every evil thing will be there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, we want to do a couple of things by way of introduction. First of all, we want to see how this is connected with what we've studied thus far. And as we have been studying through the book of James, I have suggested, at least for this study, that we're going to look at it from the standpoint of authentic Christianity. There are a number of ways that a number of themes that you could give to the book of James. You might call it practical Christianity. It's often been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. One gentleman that I was listening to his lectures on James, he called it wisdom for everyday living. And there is a theme of wisdom throughout the book of James as we're going to study wisdom tonight. Early on, James chapter 1 and verse 5, beginning of verse 5, he talks about, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And so that's a theme as well. But as I was reading and studying the book, it struck me that there seems to be an emphasis here on authentic Christianity. That is, practicing what you preach. And so, at least for this study, that's the theme that we're going to focus on. It might be helpful to go through and study it from the standpoint of another theme. If you wanted to look at it from the standpoint of faith in action, or if you wanted to look at it from the standpoint of wisdom for everyday living, or if you wanted to look at it from a different standpoint, it might be helpful to read it from that viewpoint. So, how does this text relate to authentic Christianity? Well, it talks about in verse 17 about the wisdom that is from above is without hypocrisy. It's without partiality. And he talks back in chapter 2, one of the sins characteristic of those to whom James was writing was hypocrisy. They were showing favoritism. And in so doing, they were showing themselves to be hypocrites. They showed themselves to be hypocrites in chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. As he talks, verses 1 to 12, he talks about the tongue. He says, you don't gather figs from a thistle bush. You don't gather, apples from a cherry tree. You gather the kind of fruit from the tree. If the tree is an apple tree, you gather apples from it. And so he's showing here a fountain does not give forth bitter water and sweet at the same time. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, by their fruits you shall know them. And so whether or not a person is an authentic Christian is often reflected in how they speak. James says, therewith curse we God, therewith bless we God, and then curse the man who's made in the image of God. This can't be. It's unnatural. And so it shows a person to be a hypocrite. They're not, at least in this respect or at this time, when they're speaking as they ought not, they're showing themselves to be someone who is not authentic in their walk with the Lord. So, how does this relate to wisdom? I think what James is doing here in verses 13 to 18, he's tying up a lot of the things that he's spoken of, really going back to chapter 1. Because a lot of the things that we've talked about from chapter 1 on, he touches on those things in this text. And so this relates to our overall theme, because a person who shows true wisdom or shows heavenly wisdom shows themselves to be an authentic Christian. A person who claims to be a Christian, yet their walk or their life is punctuated not by heavenly wisdom, but by worldly wisdom, then that person is not an authentic Christian. So, with that said, let's now address point number 2 as we introduce what is wisdom. When you talk about, if we're going to talk about wisdom or discuss wisdom, we need to understand what wisdom is. So what is wisdom?
The application, the proper application of knowledge.
Okay. The proper application of knowledge. Throughout the book of Proverbs, you have these 3 terms used repeatedly. And they basically reveal to us the truth of the human condition and how our mind works, or how it should work. These 3 terms: knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And these were a lot of, up until about a century ago, they were represented in the educational world. Those who were educators, they represented it by these 3 terms: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar school was the elementary school. Knowledge and grammar go together. It is the accumulation of facts. When children are in the elementary ages, then they're like sponges, and they're able to soak up a lot of facts. And so knowledge is the accumulation of facts. Understanding or logic is how to relate those facts together, how you can put them together to make sense. Matthew's studying geometry, and when he was studying algebra, what am I ever going to use this for? I would tell him, I said, algebra teaches you to think rightly. It teaches you how to think logically. Wait till you get to geometry. So he gets to geometry and he says, what am I ever going to use this for? I said, it is teaching you to think logically, how to take something abstract and put it into concrete terms in your mind so you can understand it and make sense out of it. So taking these things and bringing them all together and making sense out of them. We would illustrate it this way. The knowledge would be learning the alphabet. Logic would be putting these letters together in understandable words and sentences. And then the understanding or the rhetoric would be using those sentences to make a strong point, to argue your case. So you see this throughout the book of Proverbs: knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Accumulate the knowledge, put it together in an understandable fashion, and then apply it rightly. Apply it rightly. So it is the right application of knowledge. One of the definitions that I like is it's the ability to make right decisions, and decisions that are right based on God's standard, because we want heavenly wisdom, not worldly wisdom. So if you can apply knowledge rightly, then you can make right decisions. So this fundamentally is what we understand wisdom to be. You're able to take facts, you're able to assemble them together in an understandable fashion, and then you're able to apply them in the right way. Okay. Go to let's see, verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. What might we infer from this as to be the wrong motivation for the pursuit of wisdom, particularly worldly wisdom? We know that James is writing to people who they seem to be going, at least some of them seem to be going in the wrong direction. They seem to place a high value on measuring up to the world's standard, and not such a high value of measuring up to God's standard. You think about in chapter 2, and he talks about them showing favoritism. To whom did they show favoritism? Wealthy, impressive people who were worldly, who were impressive from a worldly standard. And they wanted to show favoritism to them. This might be, you think about the person who wants to be a teacher. He says in chapter 3, verse 1, let not many of you become teachers. Now, why would he issue this warning? Well, it seems that people were lining up to be teachers. And he's warning them, don't do that. Why would he warn them? Why would people be lining up to be teachers? Prestige. They want people to look at them. And they wanted to impress people. Look at what he says now in chapter 3 and verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in meekness and wisdom. So it's not the wise man who's out here putting on a show, but it is the wise man who is applying what he knows. He's doing so in meekness. So it may be that people were trying to put themselves out as being wise, as being a guru, as being smarter than others. And James is saying, if you want to be wise, one of the marks of wisdom is going to be humility and not pursuing the status that the world wants to put upon you. How does one acquire wisdom? Well, in chapter 1 and verse 5, he says, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and upbraids not. And so we can do it through prayer. We can pray that God will direct us in making right decisions. But another, perhaps the most fundamental means by which we can acquire wisdom is to study the Scriptures. The book of Proverbs is Solomon is saying to his son, he says, you need to pursue her. And the her here is wisdom. She will bless you if you pursue her. And so, how does he pursue? How is he to pursue wisdom? Well, he's to avoid bad company. He's to avoid foolish people. He's to avoid wicked people. He's to associate with the right kind of companions. But what's most important is he is to seek wisdom from its source. He's to find wisdom from God. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 1. I think it's verse 17. verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Before you even begin on the road to acquiring knowledge and understanding and wisdom, the very first thing you must have is the fear of the Lord. There are a lot of people out there with advanced degrees that are fools. Why? Because they have no fear of the Lord. If a person does not fear the Lord, then he may be worldly wise, but as far as heavenly wisdom is concerned, he's a fool. And so first, begin with God. Begin with the fear of God. Seek the Lord's instruction. And then begin on the pathway to wisdom, acquiring knowledge, applying the knowledge through understanding, and then applying it in wisdom. All right, let's get back to James chapter 3 here. I'm not going to get through it. I guess that wouldn't be the first time, would it? Let's contrast, and that's what we're going to try to do throughout this study tonight, is we're going to contrast the earthly wisdom with the heavenly wisdom. Wisdom's not hard. It's not hard to acquire wisdom. It's not hard to learn what God wants us to know. It takes some effort, but it's not complicated. It may be hard as far as the effort is concerned, but it's not complicated to become wise, to become heavenly wise, if we just put the time in. I think what most of us need to do is we need to learn to value heavenly wisdom as opposed to worldly wisdom. Worldly wisdom is wisdom according to the world's standards. It's making decisions not based upon what's right, according to God's standard, but based upon conformity to the world's standards. That's worldly wisdom. Earthly wisdom. If you have bitter envy, self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above. It is earthly, sensual, and demonic. The source of worldly wisdom is the world. The simple answer, if we trace it back even further, James says it's from the devil himself. And God's attitude toward it is that it is of no value. It is of no value whatsoever. It's nothing that we should pursue. We should not be envious of people who are worldly wise. Used to be a mark of honor if a person was streetwise. Used to be shameful if a young person was seen as naive and not streetwise or worldly wise. Someone who understood all the street lingo and all the street jargon basically for profane ideas and body parts and sexual activities and things like this. So if you weren't up to speed on all of that, it was a mark of shame. Well, for someone who's pursuing heavenly wisdom, that's not a mark of shame. It should be a mark of honor. It's not something that we should pursue, to understand all of the things of the world. So earthly wisdom is wisdom that comes from the world. It is making decisions based on the world's standards of right and wrong, on the world's value system, and not on God's value system and God's standards of right and wrong. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20, God looks at the wisdom of the world and says, that's foolishness. That's of no value whatsoever. This is what he means when he says the wisdom of the world is earthly. It's not from above. It is according to the world's standards. Person would look at the standards by which a Christian might make a decision and say, well, that's the most knuckle-headed thing I've ever seen in my life. Why would you do such a thing? Christian receives too much change back. Receives a $5 bill instead of a $1 bill and some coins. Well, according to the world standard, what do? Keep it. You keep it. So the Christian walks back in and says, excuse me, you gave me too much change. And nowadays, a person behind the counter would like to pass out from shock. But the Christian does not conform to the world's standard. The world looks at that and says, you're nuts. You just had an extra $4 in your pocket. Christian looks at that and says, do you think I'm going to sacrifice my integrity, my honor, my good name for $4? You have to be crazy. You see that contrast between the world standards and heaven's standards? It's earthly. That is, it comes up from the world. It comes up from the earth. Here's what the world says you should value. The Lord Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. The world says you do it to them before they have a chance to do it to you. Worst case scenario. Best case scenario, you do to them as they do to you. You treat others in the way they treat you. So if they strike you on the right cheek, you turn to them a knuckle sandwich. That's what the world says. They bring a knife, you bring a gun. These are the world's standards of doing things. It's not the Christian's standard of doing things. So when it says it's earthly, it is according to the world's standard. Sensual. Sensual. What does he mean when he says it's sensual? Okay. Okay. So it has to do with the flesh. What would the standard be then? Basic, if it's fleshly, if it's not spiritual, if it's based on the senses, then how do I make my decision? If it feels good, do it. If it feels good, do it. They used to, years ago, probably showing my age here. Years ago, there was a top 40 hit called "Loving You Is Wrong. I Don't Want to Be Right." Well, if it feels so right, it can't be. That was another top 40 hit. It feels so right, it can't be wrong. Oh, yes, it can. Now, if you're just going by the world standard is if it feels good, do it. Well, what if you just applied that to everything in life? Well, it would be anarchy. It would be chaos. If it felt good, do it. When Heather and I first started dating, I had a 65 Mustang. Had a Hurst shifter on it, big Hoocher tires on the back. And every time I sat down in that car and cranked it up, and it went like that, what I felt like doing was putting that accelerator to the floor. You know those roads in South Georgia, you could cut down that road and you didn't even have, you could go to sleep and just hold the steering wheel there. It was just a straight shot. And I lived in Valdosta, Georgia, and I worked just across the border in Madison, Florida. And man, I'd open that thing up and it ran like a scalded dog. It was nothing for me to hit 100 and 105. What if every time I got in a car, and I still, man, I like to put the hammer down. What if every time I did that, got in a car, well, it feels good. You know, there's grandma walking across the street and she's got a little grandson. I feel like, boom. You can't live like that. I'm a married man. You know, so I'm a businessman here. And, you know, I've got this secretary. She's a married woman. Well, if it feels good, you can't live like that. So it is, the worldly wisdom is sensual. Now, it's held up now as a mark of distinction. If a person lives that way, if they fulfill their every desire, then they're held up as a role model. Well, that's not a good role model. I'm not against feeling good. I like to feel good. But we can't use that as a standard of right and wrong. Worldly wisdom is sensual. When we see these things, when we see something that is according to the world standards, when we see something where judgments are made based on senses, based on whether or not it feels good, then we can be pretty safe. Especially if we have biblical testimony on something that it came from Satan, that it's demonic, that it's devilish. You look at how Satan laid out this case before Eve. And did he not appear to be wise? Did he not lay before her worldly wisdom? Did he not lay before her something that was pleasant to the eyes, good for food, desire to make one wise, and to make one wise apart from relying on God's testimony? I think that's what appealed to Eve more than anything else. That I don't have to depend on God. I can be my own person now. Well, the source of that is Satan. The source of heavenly wisdom is from above. It is from heaven. It is from God. And so here again, if we want to be wise according to God's standard, then this wisdom comes from God first. Look at I think we've already covered, let's look at a couple of these cross-references here. Question number 7. Mark chapter 9, verse 33 to 35. You have disciples of Jesus here desiring to have special status, to have special rank in Jesus' kingdom. He came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." One of the first fruits that a person will find in pursuing worldly wisdom is envy and jealousy and trying to outdo one another. And that generally, when you see envy among people, particularly you see envy among brothers and sisters in Christ, you know right off the bat that this is not something that comes from above. However, look at the nature of heavenly wisdom. As contrasted to the earthly wisdom, which is envious, it's self-seeking, it brings about confusion and evil things. Heavenly wisdom is pure, there's no hidden motives, it's peaceable, it's gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. Contrast that with the envy and the self-seeking nature of heavenly wisdom. Here you have something that is pure, without hypocrisy, it's peaceable. There, instead of self-seeking, you have the seeking of the good of others, bringing about peace, and then it is gentle and willing to yield. Gentle there, I heard, or don't remember whether I heard it or read it, but it seemed to stick in my mind that the word for gentle here means a sweet reasonableness. A sweet reasonableness. And I thought, that's a delightful way to think about it. Someone who is wise according to God's standard, and they excel in heavenly wisdom. They're sweetly reasonable about things and gentle and not self-seeking. For each of these you have fruits. And if you want to know whether a person is seeking to be wise according to the world's standard, or they're seeking to be wise according to God's standard, well, you can just use the tree test. If you want to know what kind of tree this is, what do you examine? Well, you examine the fruit. And when you see the fruit, then you know what kind of tree it is. So, worldly wisdom has certain fruit: bitterness, envy, selfishness, boasting, and lying. All of these things are associated with worldly wisdom. Self-seeking, confusion, every evil thing. These are the fruits of worldly wisdom. Heavenly wisdom, you have peace, gentleness, mercy, authenticity. That is, there's no hypocrisy. And ultimately, he says the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. That fruit of heavenly wisdom, which is probably most recognizable, is peace. If you have a group of Christians and they're dwelling together in peace, it's probably a pretty good bet that there are folks in that assembly who have heavenly wisdom. If you have a group of people together, a group of Christians together, and there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of envy, there's a lot of selfishness, then chances are there's some folks in that group who are seeking to be wise, not according to God's standard, but according to the world's standard. I think about this sweet reasonableness or gentleness. One of my favorite movies, that old black and white movie Harvey, with Jimmy Stewart and his invisible over 6-foot white rabbit. And in the dialogue in that movie, Elwood P. Dowd makes the remark. He says, I have found that in this life you can be oh so smart or oh so pleasant. And he smiled and kind of winked and said, I choose pleasant. That's kind of what I think about when I think about that gentleness or the sweet reasonableness there. Do you have any questions, comments, observations, any points of emphasis you'd like to make?